All right, my name is Rich Schmidt, and we're here with Michael Lundeen. We're at his home in Yamhill County. It's May 12th, 2022. Michael, thank you so much for joining us today.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
As you know, our first question is going to be why wine?
The short story, followed by the long one, is that it captured my imagination and my sort of puzzle-solving skills and never got boring. The long story is I was at the University of Oregon, where I had started in architecture and then studied in damn near every department that existed because I was just fascinated. I was an avid learner and I loved all of it. And then eventually it was like, oh man, I need to graduate. I better tighten this up a little bit. And so ended up in journalism. And that was great and interesting, and popped out in 2001, right in the tail end of that dot-com bust recession, and so couldn't find any jobs anywhere. And I just kind of started to get into wine. I had just planted first here on Poverty Bend Road with my dad. But I was still drinking off of the bottom shelf at the grocery store. You know, I didn't really know much of what I was doing. But a friend said, hey, harvest is coming up. And I made a bunch of phone calls. Like, well, give this a try, why not? And I only got one phone call back. It was Laurent Montelieu when he was still at Willakenzie. And he had me come out. I worked, 30 straight days or something. And like so many people say, light bulb just went on. It was fascinating and interesting. It was gastronomy and agriculture, chemistry, history and geography. I'd spend the nights just reading Jancis Robinson's Oxford Companion of Wine just because I wanted more and more and more. And that continued for a while, and worked a few harvests there. Then was able to work in the tasting room some and begin to diversify the experience. That is something that has always been fun and interesting to me, is really, I won't say mastering, but really getting intimate and getting good at all the parts, from the agriculture all the way through the winemaking, and honestly to the sales and the public consumer part. So I was taking classes at Chemeketa with Al McDonald originally, which was, so fortunate for me that I was able to spend, some of those seasons with him when he was still doing that, because what an awesome resource. And then a little later, Barney Watson doing the wine making enology part, and again, wonderful people and a great education. Meanwhile, I mostly continued my education through the industry. There was obviously a lot of growth around here at that time, beyond what I even really understood. I was in my mid-20s, and I was living in Portland and commuting out, and had just sort of fell into my first real work after college, and certainly not what I expected to start to get into at all. Couldn't find any journalism work, but I'm fond of joking that I actually got one paid gig in journalism, where a friend of mine was editing an online architecture magazine, and so he asked me for a piece about a winery, but an architectural perspective. And so it sort of put these three parts together that I had been steeped in at that point: architecture, journalism, and winemaking. Wrote this little article, it got published, and I was like, hey, I used my degree, excellent, I'm out. That was the last one. Then I never looked back, because I had no interest. Wine was just pulling me forward. Even though it took years and years, I remember sitting in a bar with a friend when he asked me a very simple question that hadn't occurred to me at that point yet. It was like, what about winemaking as a career? At that time, it's still, I don't know if I thought I was insufficiently educated for it, or if it was accomplishment too far out of reach or something, but it was like, oh, that is a thing you could do. That's a thing I could do. What do you know? And I'd been in it several years at that point. Following Willakenzie, I got a job up at Domaine Serene when Tony Reinders was there. Worked with him and some other great people, learned a ton. Worked with great vineyards, made some great wines, and that was '03 through '05. And at that point, made friends with an Italian winemaker who came over and worked with us at Domaine Serene, Mario Andrione of Castello di Verduno, and now his own project 499, all in Barolo, Barbaresco, and the Alta Longa area. And he one day was like, Michael, why don't you come work for me? And I was like, that is the best idea I've ever heard. And I made plans. I quit my job at Domaine Serene in August and went over there for 3 months. Worked in the vineyards, had a little apartment over the winery, worked in the winery. We made Dolcetto, Barbera, Longa Nebbiolo, Barolo, and Barbaresco. It was awesome. It was also exhausting because almost nobody spoke English. There was some young people that were eager to learn and practice, but it was awesome, transforming experience, of course. And it could have led to a very different path at that point. However, 10 months earlier or so, I had met the woman who is now my wife, Desiree. And so that was always in the back of my mind as we were trying to juggle time zones to talk on the phone and all that sort of thing. But I was happy to go back, of course, and that has led to wonderful things. But I became, at that point, the kernel, the little seed had germinated about starting my own wine. Over there in Barolo and Barbaresco area, there's homes, mostly somewhat modest, some more grand, but all through the hills and all over the place. Thousands in a fairly small area where the most intense quality winemaking happens, and every single one has a little winery in the basement. Usually families been making wine for generations. Some of them have gone commercial, various degrees of success, whatever. But it was a very cool sort of eye-opener because there weren't a lot of especially successful, high-quality, super small producers here. There was a bit more medium and large investment. The Domaine Druins had come through and started that model, and and I had been at Domaine Serene, like big money, big time. But I realized there, like, oh, you don't have to be big, just be good, and the rest will come through. Well, that's easier said than done, of course, but it became kind of the mission at that point. And so I came back. And worked around and about tasting rooms and off-season production as I could, and then I had become friends at that point already with Brian and Joe O'Donnell at Belpont, and we made an agreement. I went to work for him in the next vintage, which was just 2006, and that's when I made my first commercial lot of wine from this vineyard here. My first 50 cases of Pinot Noir from here. And it was a fabulous harvest, a strange harvest. I remember 90 degrees in October, very hot vintage. Not all the wines were wonderful, but it was an awesome season. The wine turned out fabulously, and I still somehow have 10 or 11 bottles, and I open one every few years, and it's a great look back all the way to the start. But that said, I was not in a financial position, despite being very fortunate here to be on this property where I'm now the third generation Lundeen. My son is the fourth, who has his grandfather's old bedroom and that fun. But I was not interested or able in trying to make some push to a winery or. I've always been, despite my occupation, somewhat risk averse, and so slower was better. I also think I understood I had a lot to learn still. So I continued working for others for quite a while. After Belpont, that's when I was doing more of the education with Barney Watson. And there I met Brad Ford of Illahee. We became friends, and he was, they had their vineyard and they were just planning the wine project, and he asked me to join on. I thought it sounded awesome. We basically took it from a farm all the way to a pretty sophisticated winery situation. The first harvest was in the pole barn at the bottom, and I remember, it was 2007. Hot summer, despite the rains we all remember from harvest. But, I spent the first couple of months all trenching water lines, pouring concrete. I learned to drive a dump truck. It was great fun. We were insulating and building out the pole barn. And I knew, okay, we're eventually going to do some winemaking. But for a while, it was everything else. And that, it ended up being spectacular. We made a great wine in a very challenging vintage, got us into IPNC on the first try. It was great, and we were off to the races. Built the winery up the hill, which was fabulous, and did another couple of vintages up there. And then we, that's then when we hit another economic speed bump, of course, and it was a tricky time to try and launch a new brand. Very tricky. We were having some early success, but we needed significant growth to really make some of the vision happen and work right. And we got a few more vintages in, and it was right after 2010. And Brad comes to me and he's like, we're doing well, but we're not selling enough wine. I don't know if we're going to be able to keep you on. And at that point, I was married, and we had moved out here, and things were going great. But we just learned that we were pregnant not too long before, and I was like, oh my goodness, dreams crashing down. I'm about to lose my job. My wife is pregnant. Holy cow, where is this going to go? And then, like so many other good things, serendipity just kind of happened. I am a definite believer in, being open to opportunity. Having your mind be open, having your heart be open, good things happen. It's not just all dumb luck. You have to participate, but there's a lot. When you stop trying to control it, there's a lot of cool stuff ready to happen. And in that moment, that's kind of what happened. And a friend of mine, randomly, I don't at this point remember if I reached out to him looking, or if he just had a thought. He's very well connected through the scene. Drew Voigt. We'd been friends since working at Domaine Serene together. And he just happened to tell me, hey, I've heard of this position down in Walnut City. Miguel Lopez is there, and he's leaving for a new adventure, and I think they need somebody. This was immediately following Harvest 2010. And so I called up and I spoke to John Davidson and went down for an interview. And it was one of those where, you're going in for an interview and you've done the resume thing and whatever, but what it turns into is like a 2.5-hour conversation with somebody that you've just made a very important friend and connection. I somehow knew, and something special happened for sure. And so, I went very quickly from this position of, oh God, what am I going to do, to, holy cow, what an amazing opportunity. I get to take over this program and this facility. When the traffic is light, it's only a 6-minute commute from my house. Hey, everything's coming together. It was fabulous. You never know. And so, began the long and complex work that adventure has turned into. And that was now 11 and a half years ago. And huge amount of my growth and development and real comfort in any skill has happened. A lot of it has happened through that period. And it's been wonderful. And we're actually in kind of an exciting inflection point regarding that place and transition, but I'll come back to that. I like to go through things chronologically. It just helps me keep track of what's going on. So, we began doing the thing, and Walnut City is owned by two gentlemen, John Davidson and John Gilpin. They also own a sister company, St. Joseph Orchard, that does vineyard management. And so I began to get inserted to that. I began just as winemaker, but eventually then just grew to fill up vacuums of responsibility, if you will, and eventually became general manager. Due to my aptitude and also interest in all the different parts, I was also able to grow into the viticulture and growing side, because that's always been interesting and important to me, as well as being able to manage sales teams and everything else. And fortunately, John and John, I learned a lot about how to sort of take care of people and how to lead, sometimes by recognizing things they weren't doing, but there was education in there. They were always very generous and always acknowledged that it's the people that make all the dreams happen. And so you have to start there. But grew through all of that and have met a lot of people over the years. There was a lot of custom crush work done, still is. And so I've made many different wines for many different people over the years, as well as the Walnut City brand that I took over at that point, and of course, Lundeen. And so the Lundeen Wines, when there, then was able to really start growing a little more meaningfully. I had a really good stable foundation. I had gradually made some good distributor contacts and began to grow the brand with sales, as well as the connection to all these different projects and viticulture clients allowed me some really interesting opportunity then to source different grapes. Many of the years that I was working there, I would be making wines from almost every sub-AVA at that time that existed, save Ribbon Ridge, but we would have grapes from everywhere else. So great education in terroir comparison, techniques, all of that, whether it was for myself or for others. Also became very enamored with really what we at Walnut City consider the sort of estate vineyard, which I am in current future-looking endeavors trying to gain sort of a long-term lease control over to be able to work with it for the rest of my career, hopefully. La Cantera, it's up above Rex Hill on Quarry Road, and it's awesome. I've made sparkling wines and rosés, red wines, everything. It's wonderful. But I can't remember, I diverged from somewhere there a minute ago, but the education part was fantastic. And to their credit, John and John, after a little while, realized I was doing a pretty good job picking up the slack and the loose ends and some of the funky wines or neglected projects, and running things well enough that they really were happy to just start to have a hands-off. I would come to them for big, high-level, important stuff, but otherwise began running all of it. Moving into the viticulture a little bit later, maybe 5 years ago, really started 6 years ago, starting to get more involved with that. And that part has been not only rewarding, there's a special challenge to farming, you know. You have to have a real willingness to embrace the uncertainty, but it is a great personal interaction with nature and trying to figure out how can I get the highest result with the least input. That's kind of how I approach it. To that end, moving all of the vineyards that I currently farm for myself and some clients towards organic, and really looking to peel away the unnecessary effort and inputs and really really get down to just the core of what the vines need and how to express those places. And once those pieces started coming together, it began to add more layers to Lundeen as well. This maybe is where I tell some of the story. So now Lundeen, at this point, I'm 1,500 cases of wine a year and growing still wines and sparkling wines. And just because I'm sitting here in mid-May looking outside at what almost feels like still late winter weather and this just incredibly weird, challenging spring that we're having, it's reminding me of another super challenging year, and I'm trying to muster the optimism around this vintage is some of what it is. Obviously not only have we had insane April that had 70 degrees and had killing frosts and snow, we're barely now through bud break in May, and it's obviously, no matter what, going to be a very late harvest with unknown quantity of fruit. Some people will have very little. But the vintage it reminds me of, it makes me think of, maybe not reminds me of, but makes me think of is 2011. Which, my first reaction is often like PTSD, sort of like, oh God, not that vintage. It was so hard. The summer never got hot. The benchmark I remember is that I couldn't eat a tomato out of our garden until September. It was so cool. Waiting forever for grapes to ripen. There were people who picked in November. I mean, it was insane. And there were some very good wines made in that year. None of those were Pinot Noir red wines that I made. I think back horribly on those wines. We made it through, we learned a lot, whatever. But the part that stands out as the positive is that was the first year that I made base wine for sparkling. I had this lot of grapes from La Cantera that I'm supposed to make red wine out of, and there's very little color in the skins. At the end of the season, I looked at the chemistries and like, oh my God, I'm never going to be able to make red wine out of this. What the hell am I going to do? I had long been a fan of champagne and Methode Champenois by then, and with a little bit of guidance from Rich Cushman, I was like, yeah, let's make a base wine, see what happens here. And of course, it was just spectacularly appropriate fruit. Made a killer Blanc de Noir from it. Hindsight then, several years later, was like, oh, I wish I'd made 10 times more of this, but at the moment it was this huge leap into the unknown. But it was it was proof of concept and learning about technique, and it turned out so well. I began to lean into it and move more towards that. And ironically now have come to look back differently on that vintage because of it. And in the same way that the Champenois right now may be somewhat lamenting climate change as it's changing their industry and their wines very profoundly, I now prefer that very cool vintage that I swore at and suffered through and whatever over some hot ones, at least with the sparkling wine in mind. Far superior, far easier in that cool vintage to make a really beautiful, ageable sparkling wine. So, this is what were we talking about? Learning from your mistakes or changing your mind a little bit, trying to stay open to that. What can I learn from all that? And some of that, to cut to the chase in this vintage is I'm thinking perhaps I should be making more sparkling wine than I was planning on. And I was already planning on making quite a bit. But too early to tell the whole tale on the vintage, and we'll see where it goes, obviously. But that became then the exciting growth part of my wine program over the last 10 years then is the sparkling. Obviously I've made red wines that I'm very proud of now. I'm making still Chardonnays that I'm very fond of, and these are selling well enough. But the sparkling, I was really pulled forward at that time more just by the excitement of it. Not even the market excitement, which has now grown quite significant. There's a lot of action. But I was out in front of quite a bit of that and just figuring and the joke was kind of, the beauty of sparkling wine is, you can make a bunch of it and you lay it down, and now I've got 6 or 8 years to figure out how I'm going to sell all this stuff. And meanwhile, it's just going to get better with every passing year that it lays down. There's some truth to that and some joke to that, but really found fabulous result. Have made Blanc de Noirs and Blanc de Blancs, blended brutes that I'm very excited about. And then things really started to take off around here, and I found myself pretty well positioned for some of that. And I won't say that there's a lot of reputation yet far and wide, but I continue to be flattered, with some frequency of people talk, they've heard about this sparkler or that, and they want to inquire. And this is usually industry folks. And in some ways, obviously, that's the most flattering when your peers tell you something about your wines. So we're now, I guess I can race through that whole Walnut City period a little bit to the latter parts. We've had some great vineyard managers, and then as we've helped them move on to their next adventures, I stepped in part to fill another vacuum, but also do a thing that I like to do, and became vineyard manager for many of these sites. As we transitioned into the last couple of years, I began to carve that down, and really it's now more about feeding the program, if you will. My wines, my clients' wines, not necessarily farming for outside groups as much. There are other outfits that may be better suited to some of that, but somehow we navigated 2020 with a combination of creativity, some support from the public and government programs, and we had to do a lot of quick thinking and learning from mistakes and carving away. And we are one of the organizations, not only those that I'm working for, but Lundeen, we're better off now because we did a lot of trimming, and we had to not be lackadaisical about strategy, but really say, okay, what do we do? What are we good at? Let's lean into that. What isn't working? Let's throw that overboard immediately. And that, led to some hard conversations in certain cases, but it really tightened things up, and so now things were running quite well. And that then put us in a pretty good position for the big kind of transition that's coming in my world. And the timing of this interview is kind of funny because it's right in the middle of this very important period. I, through a long series of conversations and opportunities that didn't quite pan out, came to realize that some good friends of mine who are also in the industry were interested in working together. And we've been friends for a long time. They have great experience at all kinds of levels, hospitality. We have made an arrangement that they're going to buy into a portion of Lundeen, and we are going to spread Lundeen's wings and try to fly in this big transition year of 2022. The industry around us is changing hugely, and we'll get back to that. But internally, I've kind of set the stage well. John and John are now quite ready to sort of retire the whole thing. They're ready to be done. We began some of that process a couple of years ago, trimming down production, making some arrangements. And so what we're working on now is I'm going to take over the building. I'm going to lease it, take the clients. I'm buying the stuff from them. The goal is, help them retire, but also, carry the work that I've done for them, with them, forward, make it my own, and really go for it now. And so there's a lot of excitement at this point. And when the participation of these friends of mine came in, I knew it was the right thing because all the fear went away. I had resisted doing this, making this move for a long time, and I didn't quite know why, but I knew I wasn't ready. And I'd had investor offers for years, good people that I trust, but I knew something wasn't right. And I politely told them no thank you for years and years and years. And I have since then figured out when this puzzle piece fit in, it's because I had kind of maxed out what I could do. There's always been this challenge of bandwidth, having all these different hats and all these different jobs, and there's a symbiosis to it, and it lets me do a lot of cool stuff, and some of it quite well, but it also means I don't have enough time to develop other skills and flex other muscles. And I was having this unconscious acknowledgement of that while turning down these offers, because I have now come to see what I was doing was, I've kept this company my own only for 16 years now, and I'm at the point where if I want to reach the next level, go farther, I have to trust in some other talent, is really what it is. And waiting to be connected to the right talent is really, I think, what it was. And so once their willingness and interest was there, it became very easy to trust and say, oh my gosh, to bring on people who are excellent at hospitality, and who know how to make consumers really happy and connect all the parts. Let's do this. Oh my gosh, absolutely. And so all the puzzle pieces started to fit together after that. And we're currently in the process of negotiating all these parts, but plan to launch a new club and sales effort late this summer here at the vineyard, and then being able to operate down at the winery. And with sparkling as one of the two major prongs. I'll continue to offer Pinot Noir and still wines. But now with this timing and excitement, being able to really focus on a high-end sparkling program. I don't necessarily, I tend to be fairly humble, or I try to be. And so there isn't an ego notion of like, I want to be the name, or I want to beat out X and Y and Z, but I absolutely want to be at the table with some of those characters, and I think we have the potential at this point, and I couldn't have imagined saying that just a few years ago, honestly. But yeah, the stage is set for some exciting times.
It's really exciting. That's awesome. I'm so glad to hear that. I don't even have to ask you what's in the future, because now I know what's in the future for you. I have so many questions to come back to, but I want to back up for a second and talk about the property here for a minute. We talked a little bit about before, kind of pre-interview about this. So tell me about the property here and about its vineyard history.
Right. So where we are here is on Poverty Bend Road, and we call it Poverty Bend Vineyard for obvious reasons. And there's a lot of historical question and irony in the name. And the old story my dad tells is that the naming of the road, it was Rural Route 2 until the 50s, I think, or 60s perhaps, and they let the people who lived on the road vote on the name. And at that time, it came down to Poverty Bend or the name of a local farming family that I won't mention. And instead of naming it after them, they chose Poverty Bend Road. So that tells you something. It's obviously a cute, quaint notion, and thankfully there hasn't been much poverty around here in quite a while. But my grandfather bought the property in late 40s, and when they moved here, my dad was young and his older sister Nancy, they lived in one of the, used to be quite common but not many of them around anymore, these late 1800s two-story things all built around a pot-bellied stove that did all of the heating and all of the cooking. And so my dad tells stories of remembering being very cold a lot. But then they built this lovely house in the early 50s. And he grew up here and then went away to school, first to Carnegie Mellon and then graduate degree at Stanford in civil engineering. He owned it with his sister, and they got to the point in the very early 80s where they decided they wanted to sell it. Well, I now, looking back, am quite thankful that the economy being a total mess in 1980 or 81 meant that they couldn't find anybody that would buy it. And so my dad bought out his sister, and so it was entirely his. They continued to live in Salem, and that's where I grew up, but rented this property for all those years. And I'm so thankful they did, because then eventually enough time passed. Those renters, some passed away and moved away, and my wife and I were ready to make that move. And it was in conjunction, it was actually right around, I think it was related to the changing from Illinois to Walnut City. And that was really the beginning of the feeling of like stuff coming together. You know, it was sort of geographical, but there's a philosophical or kind of a metaphysical part of it too. It's like, oh, coming home to this place, and wanting to care for it and carry it into the future, be successful enough with my business endeavors that I, can keep this for our son, and share it with folks, honestly. So it's been a hugely fortunate thing for us. Getting to the vineyard part, my father, in his gentleman farmer desires, as I mentioned, I'm looking out at him right now, planted Gewürztraminer, this little block of Gewürztraminer. He got cuttings from Meyer and Redford, Amity, way back when in the early 80s. Stuck them in the ground, and God bless them, these vines, they can be kind of hard to kill if you just don't screw them up too badly. He was no kind of farmer and is, a very, very smart man, master's degree in civil engineering, but he was not really any kind of farmer. But again, his traipsing into this sort of a thing worked out very well for me. And I don't know that it was necessarily done for me, but we are close. I'm fortunate to be close with my parents and other family, and so there's always been natural progression, from one generation to the next of all kinds of things. Well, when he retired from the state of Oregon in 2000, then we got to planting some of the rest. He wanted his retirement project, and I was kind of just getting going with some stuff in this industry. And we planted the first couple acres Pinot Gris and Pinot Noir. Began to fill it in after that, but the land around had been many things over the years, mostly orchard. There are remnants of old volunteer cherries and nuts, some walnuts, all kinds of things, industries that have sort of come and gone from this area. And it's interesting to look at that history, and respect that history, and of course, much further back than that. There's all kinds of interest in thinking about the history that really is here. We've found native obsidian arrowheads on the property down by the river, and I think it's important to reflect on folks that lived here an awfully lot longer ago than we are now, and how the story is a lot longer than we sometimes think of it. And we'll see where it all goes. But The funny story I like to tell, and it's not funny, it's kind of sad, but it leads through history. The story of Walnut City. For much of the early 20th century and some of the late 19th century, walnuts were the #1 agricultural crop for Yamhill County. Hugely important. We have a photo in the winery of this old guy for this exposition cracking these nuts open. And he's at the Atticus Hotel. They have a reproduction of this sort of display arch. And it was for this walnut exposition to show the world what we could do in Yamhill County with walnuts. In 1903, I think it was, or very early 1900. Big industry. That location in town had been for walnuts for a long time, and then they built a new building, and it was like the packing and processing house for much of the county's walnuts from 1951-ish forward. And then in the early 60s, what around here they call the Columbus Day Storm, huge hurricane force winds, basically blew down all of the walnut orchards almost overnight. They're these big, slow-growing trees, so they were catching every bit of the wind. And then these farmers afterwards were like, these trees take a generation to grow, and they couldn't replant that. And so then, of course, it moved to all the things that we've seen in the late 20th century, the cherries, the hazelnuts, into some grapes and other things. And almost overnight, the whole industry just evaporated. And, we don't often look back. And that's, one of the cool things I think about what you guys do is making sure that we see history and have it to reflect upon. Don't lose it. But, thankfully the building was there and was kept because it has really been the cradle of my career at this point. And it's funky, and some days I hate it. And it allows me to do some good work. I've made wines I'm proud of and happy to be going. But now, this property is a lovely spot, but there's not much room for grapes. I've got about 2.5 acres here, and that's probably all that I can really fit in sort of appropriate ground. But thus the good fortune in finding other vineyards to farm and to lease and to work together with owners to have enough grapes. And early on when I made that first batch with Belpont, I was able to take the whole production and make my 50 cases, and it grew into a product that I call Mon Père. It means my father in French. There's a little footprint on the label, and it's kind of meant to tell our generational story here. And also honor my father, obviously, for helping me do this, but he's not the kind of guy that would really want his name on a bottle of wine, and so this is a good way to do it. But it always starts with Pinot from this place, and even though it's meant to really be my Willamette Valley offering, there's always lots of notes that to me are very telltale of this vineyard, sort of tart cherries, gravelly, slaty white pepper aroma, cedar notes, things like that. So it still speaks to me of this site, even though now it's grown much bigger. I don't have nearly enough grapes for the Mon Père bottling, but it always starts here.
So I want to talk about the early days. You mentioned working for Laurent, working for Tony Reinders and others. Obviously, working for a variety of different people, a variety of different approaches and philosophies and workflows and all of that. Tell me about sort of creating your own along the way. At what point did you kind of feel like you had your own sort of philosophy style? What were you taking from people? What were you, both positively and negatively, what were you taking away from your experiences? And at what point did you feel like you actually had like an opinion about winemaking?
Oh, yeah, that's a good question. Because I'm one of those people, it took a long time for me to feel like I had, a distinct opinion and a position. I've always had a lot of opinions about all kinds of things. Oh my God, ask me a question and I'll give you all kinds of opinion. But, it took me a while to feel legitimate in that way. And I'm not exactly sure when, but I definitely went, in the first 10 years really being a sponge, just wanting to take it all in. Learning from Tony. I learned plenty of things about technique, and they're both very good in different ways at making wine and have very good palates. But I learned plenty of things about how I didn't want to make wine and exploring other approaches. And it was probably somewhat in conjunction with taking over Walnut City, honestly, where I had to be the guy. And I certainly had John Davidson as a mentor. He had plenty of winemaking experience at that point, viticultural experience. But that I was also really introduced to whole cluster fermentation methodology for Pinot that really resonated with me. I had not been especially successful with it, but it was more shooting in the dark. And they had a method that had kind of come from a winery called Flowers in California. And I began to work with that quite a bit more. The libel really started to go on there. There's this sort of parallel for me, ideas about learning about sparkling and learning about the still wines, because they're obviously importantly hugely different, but they were happening at the same time. Speaking now about the still wines, the learning about and developing and refining methodology around whole cluster became a very big foundational kind of light bulb going on for me. Big reason why many of us do this here and fight and struggle with Pinot Noir is how beguiling and transparent and storytelling it can be. Obviously, when it's great, it's like nothing else. And so everybody's happy to beat their head against the wall and try and reach that great height. It's damn hard to do. But it really, shows you place so profoundly. And we have this interesting, beautiful place here in the Willamette Valley with these very distinct different soil types. Some winemakers will talk a lot about dirt, and I'm very happy to do that also. The difference between Willackenzie sediments, the volcanic, the freshwater Missoula flood sediments, wind-deposited soils, and the very big, important, different impact it has on the resulting Pinot Noirs. That was like one of the really fascinating grab me parts, and it was developing the whole cluster technique that really allowed me to feel like I had the right way to tell that story. I have come to believe that stems now are a really important part of expressing terroir. That is a very controversial statement, obviously, and there are plenty of winemakers who hate stems and they think it's terrible and it gets in the way. I happen to feel differently about it. The stems taste very different site to site. And when that came to me, it was like, oh my gosh, we're throwing away a huge amount of the transmitter of the taste of the place. Now that said, they're not always appropriate to use. They don't always have as much positive affect to offer as negative. But when the conditions are good, when the vineyard is right, because there are some vineyards that I just can't get the stems to be appropriate. And I haven't exactly figured out if that's farming or soil. I struggle more with Dundee Hills stems, but a lot of other places. And so now for me, if I'm endeavoring to make a vineyard designated wine, a wine that wants to tell the story of a place, stem inclusion is critical. Absolutely critical. And so I'll have Viola Amity stems that taste more woodsy, like you're walking through a forest in late summer, lignified branches and some starting to dry leaves. Up in the Chehalem Mountains, La Cantera, this vineyard site, kind of the stems it tips into more mineral, gravelly, white pepper, black pepper, completely different from that other. And then there'll be sites in Yamhill Carlton where they, when they get sufficiently ripe, they almost present no aromatic impact, but the structural impact then is critical. So for me, when you do it right, it absolutely makes a superior wine. And that, having that solidify gave me okay, this is a thing I believe. For me, this is true with Pinot Noir. That was probably getting from about into 2016, 18. So 12, 14, 16, and 18 were all very personally successful years with red wines and with the whole cluster in general. Through that similar period, I was beginning to disgorge sparkling wines. And so getting over to that side, I was really beginning to see the early efforts come around and pay off, and begin to, if you don't have the benefit of growing up in France, having 5 generations of family before you learn these lessons for you and imbue you with all your wisdom, you got a hell of a learning curve in front of you. I was just having drinks with Kate Payne Brown last night, and we were talking about sparkling, and we could just talk all day about it. And that notion about there's so much to learn so fast that it's difficult. And I think I have a mind that deals well with complexity, and I'm trying to take a lot of noise and find the patterns in it and how to not drop the ball in the meantime. And that has served me well with sparkling. So getting to disgorging in that similar time frame, 15, 16, 17, 18, the wines that I had made in 11, 12, 14, those light bulbs are really going off. And I had to admit, I think I'm making pretty good sparkling wines at this point. And I could have some very, solid opinions about what I prefer. At the end of the day with sparkling, assuming that the quality has been preserved and is inherent, the rest of the conversation is just about style. There's so many dials to turn and levers to flip or whatever. And it's not to say that it's like manipulative or something. There's just many opportunities to steer, to accentuate this or that. I now will hold things on tirage for quite a long time. That's a commitment that I made that, I'd like to joke that it's the fiscally most stupid thing you could possibly do in this industry. But the hard part is really only getting started. Once you're there and you got some wine, you just start disgorging it. I mean, the results are spectacular. And it's now easier for me to sell a bottle of sparkling wine at double the price of a bottle of Pinot Noir. The quality's there. There's not a huge amount of it around here still. But, to specifically answer the question, I think by probably 18, I'd say, okay, I think I know what I'm doing here, maybe. 12 years later, I guess.
It's a good long learning curve.
I'm a winemaker. Yeah. Not that I want to stop learning. I know enough now to know that I know very little. It's one of those. But I feel competent.
So with that said, obviously you mentioned a big part of your work at Walnut City has been making wine for lots of people, making lots of different wines, lots of different clients, lots of different projects. So tell me about how that works for you in terms of finding that middle ground between your kind of natural, the decisions you would make, the decisions the client makes, and how you're making unique products for all these different people at the same time.
Well, it's some of the process I began to realize I took to very naturally because there's something that really works for me in it. There's often an element of relationship. For me, it's not really just transactional. I tend to call many of my clients friends now, and it really feels quite collaborative. So for me, it's often a matter of helping them achieve what they want to. And so it's a fun process of exploring what is it that they want to achieve, and then talking about how do we get there. The whole concept of the custom work that I do, though, is now kind of evolving. I continue to do it and will continue to do it, but I began to realize that I was interested in sharing that experience and knowledge in maybe a more meaningful way a few years ago, and began to think of it more as mentorship opportunity, really. I have a few clients now who are still, they're good in business, they operate in other states and they have me make wine to take to those places, and it works out great. But Many of the others, and certainly new ones, are newer, sometimes younger, but aspiring winemakers. And I kind of opened the door to them to say, let's treat this as a mentorship, brand incubator kind of a concept a little bit more. It makes it more interesting and rewarding for me. And obviously presents really valuable opportunity for them, as we'll get to talking about, where the industry might be going and how it's been changing. One thing is definitely that the production opportunities for small projects has gotten very tight, very difficult to find. And so I happen to have that availability and opportunity, and so happy to, let these little itty bitty projects come in, 1 tons, 2 tons. And we work together on it, and often then as a mentorship brand incubator scenario, they really are happy to work on the wines. And so it's not, I'm not necessarily making it for them. I'm often standing over their shoulder and being like, are you sure you want to do that? Have you thought about X? Things like that, making sure that nothing's going to go sideways. But that's far more interesting and rewarding at this point for me. And also, I had the experience to help them with fruit availability, concepts, sales, ideas, how to approach the 3-tier system, just business management. One of the most important lessons I learned over Walnut City and moving into being general manager was, a reminder, this is a business. I love to approach it artistically and move with my own inspirations and insights. But at the end of the day, you got to pay the bills, you got to make the wheels go around. And that's often not a skill that many of us that get into this biz have when we start. Some people, for sure. But, I definitely try to offer some of that guidance to some of these small brands. Like, it's really easy to buy fruit and make wine. But make sure you got the whole picture in mind. What's the right amount? How are you going to sell it? Have a business plan. Make it tight. Keep working it. And frankly, this is no secret, but when that part is more sound, it allows you more comfort and ability to be expressive with the other parts. You don't have to agonize over how to keep the wheels on the bus when you got the plan. And then you can really, focus on the creative parts and making the best wine.
You talked earlier about, especially with sort of the single vineyard idea and the story of a place, which is of course a term we hear a lot from winemakers. And tell me, in your opinion, what does it mean to tell the story of a place in a bottle of wine, and how do you relate that to a customer?
Well, the goal would be to include as many layers of the story as possible. I think that the richer it is, which is to say it's not only about what flavors emerge out of a glass after making wine from a place, but thinking about the place in time, which is to say it expresses the vintage as well. It may express something about the property historically or the owners. Many layers. And wine is very much an experience economy. People buy a feeling of participating in wine when they go to a tasting room, or when they buy a bottle of wine after meeting a winemaker or visiting a vineyard or something like that. Obviously the good flavor is something, but it's that experience that the people want to take home and remember. And so I'll say it differently, but come back around to the single vineyard part. One of the other bottles I make, I call articulate. I make an articulate blanc and an articulate Pinot, Chardonnay and Pinot Noir. And the name came from, I was riffing on a wine, using a lot of $10 words, as I will, trying to express it. And my wife made some comment astutely about being articulate. And it was like, Oh my gosh, yeah. I want the wine to say all those things. Not only so I don't have to, but it's more convincing when the wine does it. And so trying to take that notion of expression and put it into the wines, which for me, it kind of translates into not getting in the way. I don't make especially stylish wines. New oak is not very important. I think new oak can do wonderful things to resolve a wine, but it very quickly can, to me, get in the way of expressing a place. It just has to be used very carefully. One thing that I have also come to really appreciate is that the marriage of new French oak barrels and whole cluster stem inclusion really does something very special. They work better when together. It doesn't show on the wine as much when you have the stems, and sort of conversely, it helps bring around the structure. So for me, some of what that translates into is that as I'm trying to express a place, using high percentage of stem inclusion if possible, 40, 60, 80, 100%, depending on the vineyard and the vintage. Some of those will go into new barrels to try and really pull that structure around. The challenge is it makes the wine, in its density and its process of resolution, it gets very unexpressive for quite a while. And they can be very dumb, quite honestly. And I got really freaked out when I first did this in 2012. I made a whole cluster bottling. There was a couple of different vineyards, but 100% whole cluster. And it kind of had this great texture, but it didn't smell like anything, almost, for years and years and years. But then it began to do magical things that Pinot Noir can do. And so that was some of the light bulbs going on there, and you just have to be patient. And let the wine unfold on its timeline. So those are a couple of the notions of how I would express, place. Another is ripeness, obviously. I mean, for much of the Oregon historical viticulture time, I think people were just trying to get the grapes ripe enough. More was always better. Well, somewhere, obviously, in the last 20 years, things really started changing in like 1998, 99. Our viticulture got better too, obviously, but we got to the point where, oh yeah, you can really go too far. And so I heard this great quote from a winemaker at IPNC many years ago, where he's like, there's really two kinds of winemakers. Those that are afraid to get too ripe, and those that are afraid to not be ripe enough. And I realized that what drove my decision was the fear of getting too ripe. Tannins do wonderful things when grapes get super, super ripe, but I think when the acidity and freshness is lost, you lose the soul of that wine. I think you lose some longevity, and you lose the ability to really express that place. And do it in that really beguiling way that great Pinot can. So the picking decision, one of the most difficult, obviously, but that part is really crucial in expressing place for me. If it's a wine that just, needs to generally be delicious from the Willamette Valley, it's not as agonizing, but if I really want to show La Cantera Vineyard or Sylvia's Vineyard or Poverty Bend Vineyard, making sure it doesn't get too ripe is one of the very most important things.
You talked earlier about how you were kind of learning your trade sort of twice at the same time. You're kind of learning the still wine and sparkling wine at this sort of similar timeline. So obviously we've had a lot of winemakers talk to us about still wine, but if you were talking about sparkling, so tell me, you've already talked a little bit about kind of some of the special parts of it, but for you, tell me about the learning curve for it, and tell me about, especially early, the market for it.
Yeah, the learning curve is tough. God, what did somebody say just the other day? It was like building an airplane while you're flying it or something. It's like an unimaginable challenge to learn quickly enough. Because, to break down the general process very briefly in Méthode Champenoise, the traditional method, you make a still base wine, age it in any number of different ways, go to bottle with some more sugar and yeast, put a crown cap on the bottle, it ferments inside, and that's where all the pressure, all the carbonation is produced through that fermentation. Surprising amount, up to 90 psi. And then you age it in that bottle. And because of the yeast, there's obviously some what we call lees in there. There's the spent yeast, and it lives in that state for a while, en tirage we call that, and that part is critical and defines a lot about the style. I mean, all the points are important, but something magical happens when you rest on there. It really resolves the palate and the acidity, the mousse, the creamy expression, and it takes time to get there. But when you're there, then you go to the next phase, which is called riddling. You tip it up. All the yeast falls against the cap, and you disgorge by popping the top, and that pressure pushes out the yeast. You're left with the clear wine, and you may then finish it with a final dosage affecting the final sugar level, maybe some sulfur, maybe a little bit of another wine as vehicle for the sugar, but really little tweaks at the end. That process has to take, if you're going to do a decent job, in my opinion, well, in Champagne, I think legally you have to lay the bottle down for 15 or 18 months is the absolute minimum to call it Champagne. For me now, there's no point in getting after it any less than 2 years. And really, I think something special happens when you cross 3 years. And so at that point, from the minute you harvest the grapes, make that wine, go to bottle, age it, disgorge it, package it, get it to market, could very easily be 4 years. The other problem with that, sort of getting to your question, is you don't really know the result of most of those choices until you get way down that line. Obviously, we will open bottles along that path, check in on them. That's opportunity to learn something about the choices. But, taking that back to my history, I made base wine in 11, and then I had to make some base wine in 12 before I knew anything about how 11 even went. Very different vintage, obviously, much warmer, smoked crop. At that time, I was farming what has now become a very well-known vineyard, Bocar Hill. It's in Salem, spectacular Chardonnay site. I farmed that and made base wine that, to date, may be the best sparkling wine I've ever made. And I had no idea what I was doing. I knew how to make base wine. I'm a good winemaker, and that's something really critical involved. But it wasn't until years later that I began to have the opportunity to learn the impact of all those choices. Now you can taste with other people, and I do, and you can taste their base wines. There used to be a great technical summit that would happen at Anami. Thomas Hausman would put together, where producers would get together and we'd taste base wines and we'd try to learn from each other. But if you kind of don't have the time element, for me it's difficult to learn anything about the cause or effect of some of those choices. Mm-hmm. You can put a little bit of stuff into context, but we often are looking more if X then what. That's how we learn something. That's how I learned something anyway. So as we were going through, it probably wasn't until, as I was saying, 14, 15 into 16, where I really began to learn the effect of some of those. And then begin to lean into the results of some of those. A lot of winemaking, general public doesn't always know this, is what are just the logistical realities of your operation? How do you make decisions? Which pieces of equipment do you have? For Champagne and sparkling Méthode Champenoise, the specific press plays a big role because they get the juice out differently. And my press is small, it's not a great juice press, and so I tend to make kind of phenolic. There's a lot of texture in the sparkling. That is not what would be considered sort of classically ideal. There's usually a notion of gentler pressing, more transparency, less phenolic weight is better. Well, I didn't really have the option. I didn't have the money to buy another press, so I went with what I had. And I've a little bit developed a bit of a style around it. And one thing it's allowed me to do, I think, is if I wait long enough, I can use less sugar at the dosage. Not only is that somewhat fashionable, but I prefer the wines that way. And you don't need that dose to, resolve this very transparent palate with the acidity sticking out. There's already a more vinous wine there. The structure being held up by sufficient full pressure and acidity, and then you get the benefit of the time on the lees creating that mousse, and that does much of the job of resolving it. You don't need the sugar to do it. But I then began sort of doubling my production almost annually, leaning into it. And a little bit was like, well, geez, how much wine am I going to need 4 years from now? But also I wanted to learn more, so I created more lots, and Blanc de Noir here, Blanc de Blanc here. Let's learn more. I then took the additionally, fiscally irresponsible step of holding reserve wines, and that is when things really get real in Champagne. And it's brilliant. It takes up space and it takes a lot of forethought. But the idea in my program is then I will hold wines, typically in barrel on lees, typically Chardonnay, for years and years, waiting to get blended into a base wine. So the result is a non-vintage wine, but it may be, for example, based on the 21 vintage, and it could be 60% from 2021, and it could be 20% from 2019, and 10% from 2018, and 10% from 2017. And that is one of the cuvées that I tiraged this last time around. What happens when you have that pre-aged wine is the layering of flavors and complexity is awesome. And there's basically no other way to achieve that. It doesn't buy you the same on-lees aging benefit that the time after bottling does. That's more about palate resolution. But for the layering of the flavors and the complexity of the wine and the taste and the aroma, totally awesome. And so now, most of the wines that I'm producing are non-vintage wines because I want to capture that benefit of reserve wine inclusion. That was sort of my later build-up, and I've really gone hard into that. And I think that's going to become the defining part of the style of wines, really, which may mean I go to not having very many vintage-dated bottles. Which is also a little bit unusual around here. It's very common in Champagne, and I think certainly high-end consumers understand that notion. But around here, with all the excitement in sparkling, there's a lot of people getting into it, but they're kind of dabbling. And I don't say it to be critical, like whatever, it works for them, but they want to make a little bit and sell it in their tasting room. They're not committing to a program. They're not making large quantities. So they make a batch. It gets vintage dated. They sell it, they make another batch later. That's fine. The consumers will enjoy it. I don't know that it's going to move our industry forward here with regards to sparkling wine. If there isn't enough to distribute, if there isn't enough for anybody to taste beyond who comes and visit your tasting room, but it's fine. It's all working together, creating excitement for it. People are learning, helping some of these people do it. But I have committed to a much bigger play in that direction. I don't think I came back to the second or one of the latter parts of the question. I don't know how it was.
Just finding a market for it. Obviously, you mentioned it's a bigger deal now, certainly every year. Right. But when you started making it, it was not really a thing in Oregon yet, outside of a couple of big producers.
Right. Soder, Argyle were known. St. Innocent back in the day had made really great sparkling. He was almost like too far ahead of the game, and he made great sparkling, and then he got away from it, and I think has since come back to it. But yeah, there was very few brands, and early on I got a little bit of play just because I wasn't Argyle. It was a little bit ironic, but whatever helps get your foot in the door. At that time I was doing my own self-distributed wholesale, kind of like I do now, and so I was going up to shops, and thankfully these were, some of the best shops around, and very flatteringly, some of them had really, really great things to say about the wines. I would take them to Liner Nelson, and they would be stoked, and they would buy, everything I had on offer. And the guys at Avalon, Andy and Marcus, and they would love it, and they'd help me blow it out, and they'd find people who got it, and it didn't need to be even almost a category that existed. If you had a sufficiently sophisticated consumer, they get it. They'll get it. And so a little bit of help from my distribution, which is mostly on the East Coast. But the challenge there, and this is something that's difficult for us on the West Coast to navigate that a little bit, is because of the distance involved, buying champagne over there is like a legit, labeled champagne is more price competitive with some of our products. Having to navigate through the 3-tier system and get shipped 3,000 miles across the way. So it's a little bit harder push over there. And I get that. But so it's really been local. It's been word of mouth. It's been winemakers. Honestly, I have an industry club because there are plenty of winemakers who love the sparkling wines. And they want to be able to get them and support and whatnot. But yeah, early on it was kind of a slow build, but also events like Bubbles Fest that Anami puts on, a really good time, but it's entirely around sparkling wine, and those are the kind of events that the industry has needed, and now I'm very happy to go to that. It's always a great time. I sell everything I bring, and the customers, they get it. So, I don't know. I can't fairly comment on what the actual state of awareness is about, Willamette Valley sparkling wine. But there's obviously a lot of chatter and a lot of excitement starting to happen. It always begins, it seems like, with producer excitement, and then we try to get trade, and reviewer excitement to follow, and then eventually consumer excitement hopefully comes along with. And so, the proof of concept is already there. Argyle has made awesome wines, and Soder has made great wines for a long time, and shown what's possible. The extended tirage thing that Argyle does, 10 years laid down before they disgorge it. Totally awesome. And inspired some of the choices that I have made. And so some of that pathway was already certainly blazed, but after just a little bit of word of mouth and excitement has gone out there, now it's a, I won't say easy, but it's a very fun thing. Selling sparkling wine is not pushing a boulder uphill at all. Yeah.
My next question was going to be about selling wine, and obviously it's changed a lot in the time you've been selling wine. It's a much more crowded marketplace in Oregon and nationally and in the world. So if sparkling is easier, what about selling wine in general? How has it changed, and how do you sort of feel about, as you're kind of taking this next big step forward, how do you sort of feel about prospects and selling your wine?
Between supply chain and inflation, sort of stuff that we've experienced, unlike anything we've seen in decades, we've almost witnessed more impact, I think, on the market in the last year. Different impact than pandemic that brought its own tragedies, obviously, of operations unable to continue, distributors going down, restaurants, just awful experience. But from a competitiveness and price challenge and everything else, I almost think the last year has been more change than decades before it. Now, some of the stage has been set for a lot of those other years, and what I think is we're just seeing the dominoes starting to fall. Part of the push that I'm making is what a lot of this industry around here has done in recent years, which is to say the good work that this industry has done over 50 years has brought legitimacy to this area, real interest, and therefore much tourism. And so a lot of the way forward for a lot of folks is through focusing on direct sales efforts. I tend to feel like a balanced approach is always the best way to go, but what we're seeing now with costs getting, going up on everything much more rapidly than we expected, bottles and grapes and everything, some of what happens there is it makes your ability to sell through distribution on certain products impossible. And that's been the real challenge there, because out in the distribution world, there's a natural gravitation towards the most consumer available, reasonably priced wine, shall we say. And those are always the low margin ones. In sales lingo, sometimes they're loss leaders for certain people, which is always a terrible idea. But it's gone to the point where maybe there was a product and you had a little margin on it a couple of years ago, and in the last couple of years that has disappeared. And you can't necessarily just say, oh, hey, by the way, distributor, I'm going to raise my prices 30%, and thanks for continuing to buy it. They're going to say, no, that puts it at a price that we can't sell it anymore. Or it won't work in that same way, or we can buy 10% of it as we used to, something like that. So all the parts have to change kind of together at the same time. I don't necessarily know how others are navigating that. I'm a little bit late to the direct to consumer game because I have slowly built my sales largely through distribution and modest margin, but with very good, reliable, committed distributor partners that I've been with for 14 years in one case, and more than 10 years in another case. Very, very good. And so once again, embracing the talents of others to move my business forward, we are now having to push forward on direct sales. And so some of the plan is I'm hiring my very first employee to take care of sales and club for me, and we're going to basically make the big push to finally actually tell my story a little bit more thoroughly, as well as make these wines available, etc. There has been an under the radarness because I haven't had necessarily time to promote the brand. I can't tell you how many times people are like, oh, I've never heard of your winery. It's like, well, 12 years later, I'm not exactly surprised. And this retailer in front of my, Aaron Palmer, has this great line that we both say. It's like, someday it's going to look like an overnight success, 20 years in the making. And that's where she's at, and that's where I'm at, and that's where a bunch of us are at. But finally getting around to the part of telling the story fully, and being able to share that experience and sales experience with people to achieve those direct sales goals.
So as part of your answer there, you obviously talked about some of the recent challenges, and you brought up many of them during this interview. So obviously the last few years have brought a lot of challenges to the world in general, but obviously to the wine world specifically in some ways. So tell me about sort of the various challenges, pandemic, the 2020 harvest. Obviously you mentioned even just a couple of weeks ago the frost here in 2022. What have you had to kind of either adjust or learn or decide on in the past couple of years to get through, and do you feel like you've come out the other side in a good spot?
Yeah, man, the double whammy of 2020 with, the profound economic ramifications. I mean, beyond just the existential fear of the pandemic and public health and safety and personal health and safety, but the economic impacts were profound. And then, as you said, the smoke that occurred that really shook a lot of operations to their core. And I knew as I was looking outside at these brown, red skies, like a whole lot of us that survived the pandemic part may not make it through the smoke part. And I know a number of operations that have shuttered after that. Through hard work and quick thinking and no small bit of luck for sure, we navigated some of that by getting better at direct sales. In the same way everybody started ordering things that get delivered straight to your door, we knew very quickly that was going to be essential. And so we got more sophisticated in how to do that. Thankfully, I had already begun sort of focusing my inventory creation, getting smarter about how much was bottled and sort of bottling less of certain things. And then Mother Nature just gave us a lot less fruit. That was the other thing about 2020. It was a really small crop. And the underlying quality, as I'm sure you've heard many times, was astounding. I have chosen to bottle, as a side note, a fairly small quantity, but a number of single vineyard offerings, the most I ever have in one vintage from 2020, because the wine underneath the smoke effect is absolutely incredible. And I want that to be preserved. I want that to be explored later by myself and by customers that get it. And they want to see the wine part of that. But some of the dumb luck part was just making a lot less wine. And so then when it came time to release 2020 wines, I didn't have nearly as much to sort of deal with. And I can't take all the credit for that. That was just kind of dumb luck, I'll say. Selling fruit, contracting, positioning to be leaner and meaner. It definitely was also a good thing to be a sparkling wine producer in that vintage, because that is absolutely a direction that you can take theoretically affected grapes and make a very fine wine with minimal to no impact down the road. I didn't have enough fruit to make a lot in that vintage, but certainly what was made was awesome, and those wines will be great. That was a lesson that I have taken, that a number of others have, about a theoretical mitigation strategy, if you will, for future. We know damn well that it's pretty likely we will have to deal with wildfires again. It was shared with me the report that was written, I don't remember if it was like Department of Forestry or somebody from the state of Oregon, a paper written in the 50s that basically identified the Willamette Valley as having a huge risk to wildfire because of our forests in the Cascades and the dry conditions that exist from the Great Basin in late summer. We just never really had it go off until more recently, and so we assume we will again. A lot of other producers obviously can't just start a sparkling program overnight just because they have to deal with those grapes, but now having a program built around it, I feel much more assured. If I have to say, okay, I'm going to take 25% of the production and I'm going to move it from still over to sparkling because this is happening, I feel like it's not a risky half-cocked move, that there's some real intelligent foundation in it. And whether that's great design or dumb luck or somewhere in the middle, who's to say, but feeling good about it. As for navigating forward, I couldn't be more kind of optimistic when I think about the wines that we have and the talent of the team that I've been able to put together and what I think we can do. But But some of the uncertainty about what the industry is becoming is the real wild part. You know, I don't want to say we're becoming victims of our own success, but the changes that are happening now are so rapid because of that success. Outside investment coming in, buying wineries, vineyards, buildings, because they know something special is happening here, and people are excited to come and share in it and enjoy the wines, and many of us will benefit from all of that. And you know, metaphorically, we've talked, it's like a wave that is coming, and we want to catch that baby and surf it into the future. But at the same time, it becomes challenging for some of us, especially, you know, sort of mere mortal operations that are not enormously funded externally to navigate that. I have friends who are, you know, great winemakers and good business people, you know, honest and fair, you know, losing huge amounts of their fruit contracts because vineyards were purchased recently and things are not honored and things move forward. And so how do they carry forward? I don't know. That is one of the big pieces that I'm trying to secure. Is John Davidson, one of the guys that I'm working for, brilliantly created these long-term land leases many years ago, so that he would have fruit to work with through his career. And there's enough time left on a couple of them that, as a part of what we're all doing, I am endeavoring to buy those from him so that I know I'll have good grapes to be able to continue this work in the future. Because, boy, you know, if I didn't, I would honestly be a lot more nervous about navigating the open market at this point. It's gotten really tight and really difficult.
So you talked about that earlier. I'm curious about that. One of the things that we've seen is the change from the archive side is the large number of very small projects that have taken off in the last decade, and that seemed to be a trend going forward. So tell me, in your perspective, as you've seen that, is that something that is that going to change? Is that still going to be a trend going forward?
Man, that's a really good question. When I step back and I look at it, I think I see two very powerful but sort of competing forces impacting that. One is, I think the reason that we've seen that is that there's enormous consumer interest in the individual stories of these small producers and of the really interesting wines that they're making. And so in that way, the market is pulling them forward. But then working against that, there's these logistical and economic challenges that we're sort of talking about. And of course, small producers are always on the wrong end of diminishing returns curve, and all of those access points. I think there will just have to be a reckoning, if you will. Some of them won't be able to continue, or they will keep it so small it's their you know, weekend warrior passion project while they have their day job. That's how many of us, you know, even get started into this, and some of them will just not be able to transition past that. And that'll be fine. Maybe they'll still be able to make really cool wines that they want to, and they can get to consumers that love them. There will be others that I think it's just too difficult. So in the current conditions, you know, we're now probably looking at our third small crop year in a row. And I don't think that's happened probably since the 1990s. We've had very large crops through the teens, and that really made all kinds of things possible. Not only did it keep grape prices down and more accessible, there was kind of ample supply. Well, that tightened up really fast, really fast. And so that combo part of pricing and availability is going to be the thing that's probably the limiting factor. I mean, production space, as we talked about earlier, for a small project is hard, and I am helping some whom I can with that. But I do think the sophistication level is going up around here. It has to. The stakes are going up, and there's only so much we can do about it. But in some ways, I think it's been a long time coming and due, and it's just the process of getting there that's painful. There's only so much vineyard land around here. There can only be so much Pinot Noir made, and I think it probably should be a higher priced, somewhat limited, hard to get item. It's more extreme in Burgundy because of the limits of the space and the hundreds of years that they've been working on this, but the supply meets demand thing is kind of the same. And so I think it's people who've built their brands on availability that's impermanent, on pricing that's impermanent. They're going to have to change or go away. Mm-hmm. And I am trying to navigate some of that myself, and I'm just thankful I have a little more head start on some of it and have been able to build some good connections. But those pressures are intense for me as well, and I'm trying to think about how do I do that. Mm-hmm.
What else do you see as you look ahead for Oregon wine industry? Are there things on the horizon that you're excited about? Things on the horizon that you're fearful of?
I think we are all even underestimating the coming market success of the Willamette Valley. I think the demand is going to grow even more than our optimistic hopes are showing. Market research done by Oregon Wine Board and others shows that the growth and success of Willamette Valley wines is just about beating every other wine region on planet Earth, and I don't think that is going to slow anytime soon. I really think we are finally just getting recognized to that next level degree. That then brings some of the complex existential challenges that we got to as well. But I think those of us that are in it to win it are gonna see a lot of success, and we're gonna make hopefully pretty good wines, but have a really excited, willing audience coming here to get them. I do believe that, and that will help everybody, quite frankly. As long as you have a way to get your wines to market, that's, everybody's going to do well from a producer side. The challenges, absolutely, with one foot in farming for a very long time, I always think about those issues and what's involved. Everything from, fair labor practices and farm worker treatment and limited availability of workers, the need to mechanize and the challenging costs therein, to the biggie, which of course is, I think, climate change driven agricultural challenges. And I'm not on the forefront of those, research related releases about what's happening, but I think we're experiencing it already. I think it will grow quite a bit stronger, and of course it seems to be, and I see this in this vintage and certainly over the last 10 vintages, increased volatility. Mm-hmm. It's not a reliable trend line of anything. It's that what's happened is getting, again, we have 70 degrees and we have 28 degrees with snow in the same month of April, both of which are really weird to occur in that month. And last year, 117, 120 degrees in June. That is going to be the big wild card. And of course, the fires are right in there with it. Mm-hmm. For better or for worse, those are challenges that we all are going to share, and there is a lot of working together in this industry, in Willamette Valley and Oregon, be it from educational research institutes or a trade group or a producer cooperation. So I think there's hardworking, creative solutions to some of this stuff, but on the climate, just to get back to vineyards for a sec, on the uncertainty of warming, that there does seem to be a trend line of like growing degree days, warming going up, even if it's really doing this on the way up. And so one of the projects that I have been working on and developing a vineyard this year is with really far future in mind. Found a courageous vineyard owner who has been...
Is there any other kind?
Yeah. Willing to plant grapes at 1,400 feet in the Chehalem Mountains. Really high elevation in this area. And a little bit of it is even north facing. But we're currently designing the whole project around the idea that in the short term, I think it will be spectacular for sparkling wine. It will ripen slowly. I think the expressiveness we'll get at the appropriate chemistries will be incredible. And then if that trend line really does continue, well, maybe we'll just have fully ripened red Pinot Noir in 20 years, and you just have to be on the tops of mountains to be getting it. Mm-hmm. But we have to be looking for sort of creative solutions and maybe things that seemed crazy 10 years ago, but got to have some vision. Different rootstock choices, things like that. You know, we're now going back to deeper rooting rootstock choices that actually delay ripening, sort of the opposite of the conventional wisdom for the last 25 or 30 years. Things to help us in that unknown future.
So you mentioned earlier you kind of dropped the big future plan for yourself here that's coming up. What else for you as you look ahead? I mean, obviously that's a huge amount of your immediate future. What do you see for yourself down the line in the wine industry? What do you kind of hope to accomplish, and what are some of the things you haven't tried yet that maybe you want to try?
I see. As for my, where I'm going, the process of trying to create this new vision of Lundeen that we're pushing forward, excitedly reaching out with still and sparkling wines in a direct-to-consumer way, but also controlling the vineyards to do that, allowed me really for the first time to be thinking about the encapsulated period of the rest of my career. And maybe that's just getting old and you start thinking about the future in different ways. But, long-term lease, there's a term of 17 years left on one of these vineyards I'm trying to buy. And when I first, said that duration out loud, I was like, I'll probably be ready for retirement in like 17 years. Maybe I start thinking about this as a encapsulated project here. And we've got a long ways to go, but I'm definitely feeling, I'm feeling enough success, shall we say. It's not a financial thing, but I'm feeling satisfied in what I've been able to accomplish from learning how to make wine from a qualitative artistic product standpoint, how to run a business, how to include other people in it. And so some of what I'm transitioning into is really being able to facilitate more for other people. Mm-hmm. In the first step, that's really more about employees. There's a certain amount of it as, we're always cooperative. This is an amazingly cooperative industry in general. And I have a number of, winemakers in my cell phone that if I called them right now and told them I needed help, they would be all over it. But those that, are not as far along in their career, those are the ones I'm now thinking about, these small brand incubators or young, energetic people looking for their way forward in the wine biz. I feel like I see my charted trajectory at this point. And so I'm more interested to see, okay, what can we build together? What cool things might we be able to accomplish that I didn't see possible, but if you involve some other people. Mm-hmm. I've also got, the part of this that gets back to climate that I haven't talked about is there's a goal that's not official yet, but really what I would like to see if it's possible is, and some people have already started to do good work on this, but if I can accomplish the qualitative production goals that I have, but doing it in not only maybe a certified sustainable facility, because I've run a live certified winery for a number of years, but even going as far as maybe like a net zero. Can we build a model of a top tier qualitative winery, but that can do it in a responsible way with respect to natural resources, water, power usage, pollution, etc. Because at the moment, obviously, there's people around here making great wines, and they're just burning up as much fossil fuels as they can and using as much water as they can legally get their hands on to do it. And maybe there's a better vision that could be charted forward, but it's a challenging one. So those are some of the bigger picture, exciting things I see out there. If I can help continue to teach and facilitate access for some of the things I have, that'd be great. I don't know if that ever looks like an actual teaching gig or anything. I don't know that that's something I'm good at, but I don't know. I know a lot of stuff and have a lot of opinions at this point, so happy to share them with people.
So last question for you. You talked earlier about the sort of the generational aspect of the land you're on and the vineyard here. So do you have any thoughts on Lundeen as a possible legacy project and looking forward and living beyond you?
I'm leaving that question entirely for the future. I don't have any designs or goals on it. It does bring me back around to something hugely important to me that I actually didn't bring up here, is that, no matter what I accomplish with my job, I really truly feel the most important work that I will ever do is being a father to my son. It's been hugely rewarding, very fun and exciting, and also maddening and challenging, but super important. And some of what that has meant to me is that I want to do everything I can to help prepare him to be a sentient human being who goes out into the world as a fully fledged person, gonna explore it for himself. There will absolutely be work for me that he has to do, and just like there's chores and other things like that. But I would only really begin thinking about as a legacy thing if he, all by himself, went out into the world and came back and said, "Dad, I think I want to do this." I don't have any need to try and mold him into the next version. So we'll see. I mean, I'm open to it. It would be cool. There's also a certain amount of ego stroke involved in there, and it's a little personal approach of mine that I tend to try and avoid decisions that are largely for the benefit of one's ego, as much as possible.
As much as possible.
Yeah.
Like that.
Yeah. I feel like there was another part to that question.
No, that's it.
Oh.
That's it.
Yeah. We'll see. We'll see where it goes.
Excellent.
One step at a time.
Well, that's all the questions that I have for you. Is there anything I didn't ask that I should have? Anything we didn't cover here today that we should have?
I'm sure I could easily go on and on, make a play to become your longest interview ever. Nothing is coming to mind. Yeah, it's a fun and unusual biz. I never expected to get here. I mean, that's the beauty of life, I guess. You end up in places you don't expect, and hopefully you find success and satisfaction there. And I totally have. And we'll see what the future holds on this wild adventure, but I'm having a good time.
Excellent. Thank you so much for your time, for your hospitality, for sharing your stories, and for breaking the news of the future of Lundeen Wine for us. And we'll go ahead and let you off the hook.
Awesome. Thank you very much.